Welcome, everyone, to this evening's event celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. We are so happy to have you here. I'm Brittany Carter, the MSU Museum Education Program Coordinator. At the MSU Museum, we envision an MSU community inspired and informed by the arts and sciences, working collaboratively, creatively, and equitably to solve problems and pursue a better world for all. We are delighted to be partnering with MSU's Multicultural Center, Chicano Latino Studies, and WKR to bring you tonight's event, Beyond Borders, a conversation with Dr. Fredrick Luis Aldama, which explores the complex feelings of identity for Latinx communities through his various amazing works. This important program highlights our continued commitment to working with Latinx communities to uplift their stories. Of course, this program would not be possible without the generous support by the Huizar Rivera and Pedro Rivera DO Mexican American Cultural Endowment. I am very happy to introduce Deanna Rivera to say a few words. Deanna Huizar Rivera was born in San Antonio, Texas, and later migrated to Pinconning, Michigan with her family. She earned a BA in Racial and Ethnic Studies from MSU's College of Urban Development and a Master's in Library Sciences from the University of Michigan. She completed coursework in MSU's Chicano Latino Studies program and was selected as a fellow of the Smithsonian Latin Museum Studies program, graduate fellowship, and the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture. Deanna curates Black Velvet exhibits and has installed ofrendas in the Lansing and Detroit areas. After marrying Pedro Rivera, her college sweetheart, they settled in East Lansing, where they raised their sons, Javier and Diego. She retired from the MSU libraries after 37 years, having headed the MAP library, serving as the head of the Cesar A. Chavez collection and working in special collections. Her interest in museums was influenced by MSU's museum director, Emeritus Kurt Dewhurst. This interest led to the establishment of the Pedro Rivera D.O. Mexican American Cultural Endowment, aimed at providing programmatic activities about Mexican Americans in Michigan and the Great Lakes region. These speaker events highlight their love for the state and the contributions of Chicanos and other Latinx communities.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. This program is something that my sons, my family, feel is very important in order to move Pedro's legacy forward. Pedro was, he's always been a Spartan. He was born in Sparta, Michigan. He grew up in Michigan. And he went to Michigan State University, graduating, from undergrad and the DO school. In all the years that he was working here in Michigan, he always found interest in our culture. It's something that after he passed, my sons, Diego and Javier, and I had a conversation, and it was, what are we going to do for Tata? That's what they called him, as Tata. And we felt that an endowment in his name would be probably the best way to commemorate his work, his interest, and his love in sports and music and culture and travel and his home state. That it's here at Michigan State University is very important to us. It's important to us because this is all we know, right? This is all we've known through him. His love for the Spartans, and it's something that we feel this is how we can contribute. We're not a rich family. We're not necessarily a rich community either. But what we do find is the opportunity to contribute to arts and culture and history and social justice and labor issues in his name. We find that in getting people to contribute in whatever way they can, performing, volunteering in whatever places that they feel is their area of interest and their forte. That is what was very important to my husband. He worked for low pay, as a doctor. And I say this because many of his patients were elderly Latino patients, Spanish-speaking people, who paid him in Afghans, in cologne. He never wore cologne. They paid him with tamales. And for them and for him, that was an important way of sharing and giving opportunity to have our culture carry on. And I know that if he were here today, that he would say, yeah, you did okay. That's exactly what I think we should do, because his heart was at MSU. So I hope that you find, there's a brochure out there that if you can take and share for future contributions. The endowment is already endowed, but it makes it possible for us to have programs like a 2-day program that Dr. Aldama is going to be providing MSU. And I think that in having something like this funded by a Latino endowment, I think is pretty significant. There's very few endowments at MSU that are Latino based or named in someone's honor. I had the honor of meeting Efraín Marinas years and years ago when I was a freshman in college. Their family, or his family, Juan Indiana, established an endowment in their name for farm workers, student farm workers. So I think that if we start filling in all these needs that we have or that we contribute to or that you would like to see our students excel in, I'd really like to encourage you to do that. Again, thank you for coming. The hour is early, we know, but Dr. Saldivar said, we're about the quality, not the quantity. And you are the quality. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, Diana. All right, and thank you all. I am also happy to now introduce our facilitator for the evening, Dr. Samuel Salvidar. He is the Director of the Office of Multicultural Enrichment and Advocacy and the inaugural Director of the Multicultural Center here at Michigan State University. He is, excuse me? Oh, I'm so sorry, please come up. Catalina, I'm so sorry. I thought Deanna was going to introduce you. I apologize, everyone. There's going to be one more speaker about the endowment. Please come on up. Thank you. So sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Catalina Rivera Martin, and I'm the youngest sister of Pedro Rivera. I was asked by Diana to just say a few words tonight, and I'm happy to do so, honored to do so. Obviously, I know him in a much different capacity than many of you here today, but I'm excited to talk about my brother. I know we're going to hear a lot about storytelling tonight and the power of our stories, and I know that every good story I have involves him as well as my other brothers and sisters. First off, my brother was always smart, very smart. When he was about 14 or 15 years old, he entered a contest at the local newspaper, and the grand prize was going to be a Funk and Wagnall's encyclopedia set. And he submitted a question, and the question stumped the judges. So he won that set of encyclopedias. And we had so much fun with that set. We used it all the time to, do our book reports and our school reports and just look up stuff when we were interested in something. I know that he was really, really proud just to bring that learning into our house. And it was just something that I'll always remember. Plus, my brothers never put anything back in alphabetical order, which drove me crazy. But anyway. My brother could also be very mischievous. He always loved sports, as Deanna said, the Tigers, the Pistons, the Lions, even when they were crappy. And so he'd be really excited now. We never had a paved driveway or a basketball hoop or anything, so he and my other brother Juan would just play basketball inside the house. So they would play basketball around the dining room table. And one day they were playing basketball. He always called himself Pistol Pete. So he would narrate his plays as he was, playing basketball in the house. He went up for a layup. The basket was an imaginary basket at the top of the windowsill. And he threw a ball up there, and it went over to the china cabinet and hit the china cabinet. And it knocked over some two figurines that were there that my sister had brought back from her tour in Vietnam, and they broke. So we all just kind of stood there for a minute, didn't know what to do, but he probably knew at that point he was going to be a doctor, because he ran and got the rubber cement and put that figurine back together. He put the arm back on, he put the little umbrella back on, and then he realized he had a witness, me. I was probably 9 or 10 years old at the time. So he said, okay, we need to huddle up. And he said, so I don't think we should tell Mom about this, because, it would just kind of make her sad. And I put it back together, so it looks all right. So we're not going to say anything right now. And I said, okay, can I tell her tomorrow? He goes, no. He said, so let's just wait a while. And I said, okay. And I said, how long? He said, about 25 years. And I said, okay. I mean, I was 9 and 10, what did I know? So anyway, we got it put back together. I had my orders. And so when I was about 35 years old, I said, hey, Mom, I have a story to tell you. So, it was, I could go on and on. We just had so much fun as kids. And, like Deanna said, we didn't have a lot of money. We were poor. My father and my mother were migrants. And they became dairy farmers. But it was just being there with them that made life great. It was years later when I was a student here, and after he became my glasses are fogging up like crazy. It was years later when I was a student here, and after he became a physician and instructor on this campus, that I saw the person that many of you remember, a dedicated, respected, and powerful advocate for the students that he worked with and this community that he served. He would be the first one to tell us all, keep telling our stories and keep talking about the legacies of our parents and our family. I know that we're in some challenging times where there are those who may want to erase our history and silence our memories, but we won't let that happen. No. So thank you for coming, and thank you for letting me talk about my brother.
I apologize for jumping the gun there. Thank you so much for sharing the stories. It's very wonderful to hear all of them. All right, so now I am very happy to introduce our facilitator for this evening, Dr. Samuel Salvidar. He is the director of the Office of the Multicultural Enrichment and Advocacy and inaugural director of the Multicultural Center here at Michigan State University. He is committed to empowering students and student leaders through international support and programming that focuses on leadership, advocacy, and access. He is a first-generation borderlands kid from deep South Texas who spent his summers working in Wisconsin. Samuel holds a dual PhD in Chicano Latino Studies and English Literature. He and his partner have 6 sons, ages 19, 18, 16, 18, 9, and 7. His home is very busy. He loves hiking, writing, daydreaming, football, and grilling. And then he will further introduce our speaker. Please give it up.
Buenas tardes. So my name is Samuel Saldívar. I use he, him, él, ellos pronouns, and I will be your facilitator for this evening. But before we get started, I have to acknowledge the dynamic that I am currently negotiating at the moment. So yes to the Multicultural Center, yes to OMIA for the folks who are from the MSU community, but when the chair of your dissertation and the chair of your master's thesis and the librarian who got you through your dual PhD are sitting in the audience, it changes the dynamic. So hi, Salah. Hi, Diana, and hi, Pedro. This evening, we're going to be exploring the concept of this Midwest borderland Michigan state space. One of the unique negotiations I have constantly confronted, moving from the South Texas borderlands to what I would call the Midwest borderlands, right? Michigan is a borderland state, has been how we negotiate Latinidad, the Latinx community development in our spaces, particularly in East Lansing and Lansing. So when Brittany approached me and said, I have this idea, we're working with Rivera Endowment, are you interested? I said, yes. Very interested, very grateful to be here tonight. I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Fredrick Luis Aldama, AKA Professor Latinx, is the Jacob and Francis Sanger Mossiker Chair in the Humanities at the University of Texas at Austin, where he founded and is the director of the Latinx Pop Lab and its initiatives, including the annual BIPOC Pop Comics, Gaming and Animation Art Expo and Symposium, and the Latinx Pop Magazine. He is also the editor-in-chief of Flower Song Press. He is an award-winning author, co-author, editor, and co-editor of dozens of books, and the editor of numerous book series, including Latino Graphics and Brown Ink, which publish Latinx graphic fiction and nonfiction. He is a producer and co-creator of the first documentary on Latinx comic book, Superheroes. He is the author of several children's books, including The Adventures of Chupacabra Charlie, which I will admit, kiddos love. And the award-winning Con Papa, With Papa, as well as producer and co-creator of the animation short Carlitos Chupacabra. Cannes Film Festival 2023 viewing actually occurred. He has been inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters, National Cartoonist Society, and the Ohio State University's Office of Diversity and Inclusion Hall of Fame. Recently, he published works that include his novel, The Absolutely Almost True Adventures of Max Rodriguez, graphic novels Labyrinth's Born and Through Fences, as well as the comic books Pyroclast and the Steampunkera Chronicles, which is forthcoming. He sits on several boards, including Ad Astra Media, Break Bread Literacy Project, American Library Association Graphic Novels and Comics, and the American Academy of Poets. He also consults for Ubisoft and PBS Austin, Tubi, among many other stations and programs. Folks, help me welcome Dr. Fredrick Luis Aldama.
All right, so we're actually going to have this as a conversation, which is great, right? As advertised.
Hello. Okay, good to go.
We have my mic going, your mic going, so let's move to first. Yes, again, thank you so much. Gorgeous, absolutely brilliant, and you're right. We need to give back when we can and however we can. So thank you for making this happen. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm absolutely fascinated. So Dr. Aldama. But I'm absolutely fascinated, Fede, with this idea of going beyond borders, the way it's titled, particularly because in the Midwest, one of the things I've often encountered is the idea that Michigan isn't identified as a borderland state. So then we start negotiating these really unique stories, right? In my time at MSU working with students, this idea of their particular story in relation to land and space is something that, for me, helped me understand their lived experience. Now, you in your work talk about often this idea of story, particularly this concept of like big story and little story. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your maybe little S story or big S story with the community here today.
Yeah, and by the way, thank you for taking the time to share your stories. No, really, we need to open those spaces more, and that's actually what this talk is all about. Big S story, little S stories. We are the little S stories. Every once in a while, we get access to the big S stories, and we celebrate. We love that moment, right? But it's not very often. We keep going. We keep our little S stories going. My little S story started. I was born in Mexico City. My dad was a super activist. Lost a lot of friends in the Tlatelolco massacre of '68, and while he was a committed activist, he didn't actually end up being the greatest dad. So my mom, who's Guatemalan Irish from East LA, put us on a bus and took us back to California. And I was that generation, 70s California, where we were told not to speak that dirty Mexican. We talked a little bit about this. So my little S story already started with these kind of big figures in my life. My mom, who I saw go to work and put herself through a bilingual education program at Sacramento State. And a dad who I would receive letters from and so on, who was a hardcore activist, right? So this is my kind of the background, my origin to Little S story. And then growing up in Califas and, continuing from there, yeah, my Little S story.
Wow. That I really appreciate, kind of that acknowledgement of that Little S story. I'm wondering if you could perhaps share a bit more about what you started to notice as it relates to this concept of like the big S, little s, that interplay or the negotiation of that in your work, and kind of as you journeyed as a student, then scholar, author, creator.
Yeah, it's access in the end. Access, and because one of the things about Little S stories is making sure that they are told and that they are visible and that they find places not only in comics, in pop cultural spaces, in museums, in archives, but also that new generations have access to story think as if, what if, new spaces and new stories for themselves, just like us. So it's not just about getting to the big S stories, it's about opening the spaces so that new gen Latinx, new gens in general, and by the way, now with AI and social media as huge distractions from the imagination, our capacity to what if story think and what if story make are becoming narrower and narrower for everybody. And so part of it is not only in my education spaces, but you mentioned editor-in-chief of Flower Song Press, BIPOC Pop Symposium and Expo. Deanna's been to that. SoulCon that was at OSU. Opening these spaces so that not only can the what if happen, but others can collectively come together in and around the what if, and the story thinking exercises, the counterfactual thinking and exercises that manifest in story making.
So this kind of leads me into another question. And I do want to share with the audience that I did see the presentation, so I started like jotting down all these questions. So that is my connection to it. As you think about this, there is this term that you identify in your presentation as this concept of lived experience becoming scholarly knowledge. And I absolutely love that, right? Because to share a little bit about my story in brief, it wasn't until I was at university that I understood and was introduced to this idea that the Latinx narrative existed, right? Even growing up in the borderlands, even growing up in the South Texas borderlands, I'll say, this idea of Latinx narrative existing, that little S story persisting and existing somewhere, was not a thing. I had to travel into this Midwest, take this very specific, unique class at a university to kind of learn about the idea that my lived experience could be explored in a scholastic way. So like for me, I'm wondering kind of how this idea of lived experience becoming scholarly knowledge as a way of introducing these new areas of agency, visibility, access, and I would even argue maybe power, right? The idea that to have the agency, and maybe the word privilege gets introduced. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about this process of Latinx lived experiences becoming scholarly knowledge, and how you see your work shaping these consumer spaces, these social spaces, even in academic spaces.
So one of the things that we know well, many of us, and this is a hinge moment in my life when it could have been very different, and I think many of us have this in our rearview mirror every day. I never forget this moment, which is to say that it could have been very different for me if I had gotten in the car with my best friend Miguel, whose older brother held up the 7-Eleven, unbeknownst to him, and because he was accessory, ended up going into the system. I would not be sitting here right now talking with all of you today, or maybe in a different capacity. What I'm getting at is that our spaces of access in and through the tools of education and the kind of critical thinking and shaping of our possibilities in and through story become very, very narrow and narrower and narrower as we grow as Latinos in this country. So what do? All of us in our different capacities in the audience in different ways, constantly trying to keep those doors open. But our K through 12 system in general and education system globally is a push out, lockout. So what are we doing? We are basically obliterating the capacity for the kind of critical thinking, right? And also the possibility for shaping story, and by obliterating that, we are curtailing, not us, but in general, the education is closing the door on the possibilities of new generations, us, in fact, also closing the possibilities of future selves, right? The possibilities of multiple what-ifs, paths that we might be able to take, right? Because the education system is like this for us. And if it's like, even that's if we're lucky. Right. Normally, it's actually a lockout.
So this kind of pushes me, and this isn't part of the conversation, like my questions, but it's making me think about this phrase you use called story thinking. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that, because as I was kind of preparing for our conversation today, I was just fascinated with this idea of building capacity for story thinking as it relates to our lived experiences.
Yeah, so in my classroom, what I do, first of all, no phones in my classroom, no computers in my classroom. And Wednesdays are interactive Wednesdays. So whether it's a debate or a bingo detox or what have you, my students are all analog. I mention this because AI, social media are massive distractions, and they atrophy our story thinking muscle. The story thinking muscle is the thing that we exercise when we imagine, when we daydream, when we co-create with others in listening to their story. And suddenly their little s story becomes a story world. Story thinking is the muscle that we have to fight to allow our students and new generations, including us, right, to be able to exercise daily. Because if we don't, we become A equals B thinkers instead of A equals what if thinkers. And it's the what if that opens the doors to possibilities that we don't see in our present. And the more tools and access we have through education and other spaces to realize that what if in our lives means that we have many more paths that we can follow instead of one that has been determined for us. one that has been determined for us, story thinking, exercising the story thinking muscle to materialize story making, in my case, with comics, right? Animation, art, etc., but also theoretical books, but theoretical books that are talking to their audience, right? And to a wide audience, Sam, you know this. All of my books, with the exception of my dissertation book, talk to the reader. They talk to the reader. They invite the reader to co-create knowledge as the pages turn.
Okay, so I'll put my phone down. And I'm just gonna riff, because so story thinking as the muscle we use to kind of create this idea of a story world for me is absolutely phenomenal as I'm processing this concept of border crossing and moving beyond borders. Because I think one of the things I've been really curious about as I navigate meaning making in story world formats is this concept that when I'm thinking about a story world, right? You know, in my bio, I write stories. When I'm thinking about story worlds, the idea of story thinking as an active agent, not what stories have I received and what stories have already been identified and created as a Latinx identifying individual, to me is really interesting. And I'm wondering if you could spend a little bit of time kind of just journeying with us through that story thinking gap filling, right? Because the idea of moving from story thinking, like I now have agency to think about a story beyond the world, right? I get to construct my world, which is really interesting. When I think about the narratives that I've received about what it means to be Latinx, in this case in the US, where I'm not funneled, as you say.
And even more specifically, let's if you will allow me, let's locate it regionally. So what does it mean to be Sam Saldivar in Michigan with stories? And what does the regionalism also mean in terms of determining access to making your story the big S or the visible story? Because we are in the Midwest, and yet, well, I think we got Superstore. Wasn't that set in the Midwest? I mean, if we're talking about pop culture, Superstore was set in the Midwest. Maybe one other pop cultural kind of representation. I don't know, Sam, you might know better than me. But what does it mean, your story experiencing past, present, and what-ifing a story in the future as a Latino who is shaped by a very regional borderland experience, but don't have the access that maybe the coasts or the Southwest have traditionally had,
Right.
to be able now to get your story out there, because guess what? There are others that want to conjoin and co-create and want to see them in your story so that they can not only feel less alone, but they can be empowered to tell their story and to shape a possible future story.
So I think for me, the Midwest, when I think of how I've negotiated my Midwestern experience, kind of spending my summers in Wisconsin, making that travel, I was very aware of this like invisible border that would be crossed somewhere just past Oklahoma, right? And this idea that for me, when I thought of the Midwest and when I've understood the Midwest in my lived experience, it's been this idea of movement and migration. And I'm really interested in this idea of story thinking as it relates to kind of how you situate movement and this idea of going beyond borders, right? A lot of what I've really been interested in your more recent work has been this idea of like the border is just a thing, right? And historically, I'm thinking of some particular books that make the border the space. But when I moved to the Midwest, I was like, wait a minute, there's a border here that no one really talks about. And that was fascinating to me, right? This idea that, all right, when we talk about borders, we're thinking about the US-Mexico border, okay, from a Latinx perspective, but the lived Latinx experience, when I like went to go see the Detroit International, like it was just weird to me. Like, wait a minute, we're in the borderlands here also.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me wonder about this idea of how you situate and construct and understand borders in your spaces when you're thinking, when you're creating, when you're story thinking. How do borders function in your story thinking process towards that story world where the border becomes a part of the narrative you create?
One thing is, and this has been theorized, but we all have even experienced this, the border or the borderland as wound, but the borderland is something that we have been in a way forced to carry with us wherever. And sorry, can you turn the sound down just a little bit on that one? Thanks. Where's the joy? Where's the joy in this space? Because it's in the joy and the story thinking of joy in our spaces and in our community, right? That we're going to find a way out. That we are going to together find a way out, whether you are in Texas or in Michigan or in New York, Florida, or California. Yes, we have trauma. We have legacies of colonial trauma, and we continue to carry with us the wounds of a borderland. But if we don't also see the complexities that come from the joy and the love, right, then we will not see our way out of the bag of how the borderlands has been used and how we've internalized it to keep us separated, isolated, and imprisoned in our thinking, in our action, and in our affect, our emotion.
I want to push that a little bit further because for me, if you could go back one, I think that we see some of these children's and a young adult literature right here that I want to ask about when we think about affirmation and love, because the word that came to mind as I was negotiating this and I've read some of these books has been agency, right? The idea of the significance of representation when we sit down and we say we're gonna have this conversation, right? I mean, this is just a silly aside, but the tears that were flowing when my kiddo saw Miles Morales and was like, now I'm Spider-Man, right? Like, now I can put it on. I took a photo. I was that parent that was like, I'm gonna take a photo of this because, like, to me this matters. He has no idea, right? It was Alejandro, by the way, if you ever meet Dro. But he's sitting there going, like, now I can be Spider-Man. Like, now I'm Spider-Man. And I remember documenting this, and I'm wondering, when you're thinking about your young adult fiction and the children's books, they have this centering, if you will, of this like idea of Latinx affirmation and joy, right? So The Adventures of Charlie Chupacabra, like, you reclaim this, for lack of a better term, growing up, for me, chupacabras were like what you avoided, right? Chupacabras, el cucuy, la llorona, they were these things you didn't want to encounter. And what I'm fascinated by is the idea of, one, reclaiming Chupacabra Charlie as this agent of freedom and this agent that introduces joy, affirmation, visibility. I was really curious. I'm going to be, like, the first time I read this out loud, I was like, what? Could you say a little more?
So, Sam, okay, so this is a really great, thanks. This is a softball, right? Like, what Chupacabra Charlie the plot hinges on him with a magical silver key freeing kids from cages. Okay. There is something really serious there. Okay. Just like Where the Wild Things Are has also some serious, children's stories in general, but I use my what if story thinking capacity. What if Chupacabra Charlie is vegan? He doesn't have fangs, right? He goes on this adventure. He's on the Mexico side of the big giant wall. Talking serpents, all sorts of really cool things, including, by the way, the 67 Impala its combustion engine is powered by a jar of pickled of pickles, right? Etc. What if capacity? Right in front of us, we have trauma every day. Undeniable. Like, you would have to have your head tucked way down deep in sand not to know and feel and experience. My challenge to you and to me and to you is to story think, right, from there to a place of affirmation and joy. Because if we only stay in the present, then we become imprisoned by the present. So story thinking, and then ultimately for someone like me and you, in your storytelling, in whatever way you materialize it, has this wonderful, magical opportunity for us to what if our way to a different place, not only of thinking about ourselves, but opening the door for the little ones to see and think about themselves. Miles Morales, for your son, is not only an Afro-Latino representation that we've been hungry for, but also an invitation to daydream himself in a what if affirming story of his own possibilities that he didn't see before. So it's not just representation that we are actually after. Representation invites, and when we don't have a lot of representation, we become hungry for those doors that are open to us. But it's what we do once we pass through the threshold that is exciting for me.
So, okay.
Let's move to something fun. That seems like a lot of text to me.
Well, okay, so I got one more question, though.
Yeah,
I got one more,
okay,
I
okay.
got one more question.
Okay, tell me.
One of the things that I'm really fascinated by, and this goes back to tropes, right? Like this idea of that we exist in one particular space. So like this is probably too much information, but a couple years back when my mom visited and there's the adventures of Chupacabra Charlie there, it's this really unique conversation about what it was and is and what it could be, right? And I think that negotiation of the disconnect, right? Perhaps a little bit of unlearning of like my
Unlearning, yeah.
6-year-old mom, because this is being recorded. But my mother's sitting there going, yeah, this shouldn't be in a children's room, right? Like you're teaching them about chupacabras, and I'm like, well, wait a minute. It's this reimagined thing, right? I'm really curious about this big S negotiation of how Latinx characters have been created and what your work seeks to kind of traverse.
Story thinking is also about decluttering. It really is. Like, that's why I don't let stuff enter into my classroom spaces with my students that's like distracting. I want them to be bored. I actually invite them to be bored because it's in that space of the imagination, that pause, that we declutter. And it's with many of us in our families, the decluttering also can include the sweeping out of things that become mind-forged manacles. The mama, the grandma, who's like, no, chupacabra shouldn't be something that we read, or chupacabras do this or that. Yeah. Well, guess what? Let's let our imaginations explore and see what they can do with a chupacabra in ways that might open new possibilities. Guess what? That is decolonizing in practice. It's decolonizing. It is decluttering decades, centuries of mind-forged manacles that tell us this is how it should be, instead of asking and inviting, what if?
I mean, so like I'm
Can
stuck.
I just talk about this slide?
Go for it.
So what happens when we have this constantly as our big S story? And of course here, it's big S stereotype story, where we have not been allowed, Midwest, etc., for the little s stories to actually complicate what it is we are, who we are as a very diverse, complex community with certain shared values, with very deep shared colonial legacies that we're trying to declutter. But what if this is the stuff that we're constantly getting as our master narrative, as our big S story? The cold Latina, right? Finally, on a big billboard, the Ana de Armas as like this hypersexualized, constantly hypersexualized Latina, Sofia Vergara, right, etc. Video games, the Amazon Barbie. So then it becomes even more of an exercise, story thinking exercise for us to understand critically what's going on, but at the same time, by understanding it, clear it out, declutter, so that we can open our own imaginations, this little one's imaginations, right? To have the same kind of space. And the many of the little ones' imaginations to have this kind of space, so that this is not the only thing that we're fed, right? Hypersexualized criminal and the bumbling buffoon, right? This is what we get. Or the big S threat story, right? So back to some of the earlier points, like why I'm editor-in-chief of Wildflower, Wild Song Press, why I have Latino graphics, brown ink, all of these, because it's not just about me creating and getting my little S stories out there. It's about providing venues, as many as I can possibly do, right, for others to be able to get their stories out there as well, to push against all of this stuff.
So okay. In a recent interview, you stated stories aren't just entertainment. They're the blueprint of our cultural DNA, shaping how we see ourselves and our communities yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And I really appreciated that comment, because what I hear you talking about is this invitation to be creative, this invitation to start story thinking.
Yeah.
So I guess it makes me wonder, with the time that we have, like, where do you see Latinx stories trending as we attempt to forecast these next few years in the US particularly?
Well, okay, so just when I started getting excited, because we started seeing, storytellers in writers' rooms, behind cameras, in front of cameras, in ways that we'd never dreamed of a decade ago. But now, oh my goodness, like, it's hard not to be, right, super pessimistic. But yeah, I mean, what I can say is, we always find a way. We always find a way. You throw it at us, we will find a way. And we will be stronger. And we will find a way and be stronger precisely in our stories, in the way that we share our stories. So we need to support those who are out there doing this work, our Latino, our BIPOC creatives. We have one here in the room, just got their degree, comic book storyteller. Buy their stuff, seriously support them. In the endowments that we're talking about, wherever I can, I always open doors, right? So like Brown Ink, Latino graphics, they're all like spaces for us to get these things out there. We stand strong in solidarity, we will survive. But honestly, it doesn't look like it did, where I was like, oh my God, we have so much going on now. We've made it. We finally made it, right? When Ariana DeBose won the Academy, I'm like, what? And then when she announced an openly queer Afro-Latina who found strength in life and art, and then she opens her arms to everyone who has been forced to, quote, live in those gray spaces. Like, and then what happened? It's very dark, but it doesn't matter. We keep going. We're doing this right now, and we will keep going, and we will keep opening those spaces. Our librarians, front lines, our archivists, our the folks that are putting all this work in to make something like this happen. Our educators, our K through 12 educators, our pre-K educators. We gotta stand strong against, because if not, the story thinking will be crushed. And guess what? When you crush story thinking, you pull the heart out of the chest of us as human beings. It is the heart that beats in our chest. Story thinking and story creating is the very thing that connects, that complicates, and that humanizes. You crush it, we're gone. Not just us, everybody.
They just picked Bad Bunny to be the headline for the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
That made me a little hopeful. And I'm not trying to be snarky or funny, but I think in these Ariana DeBose's idea of living in the gray space resonated with me as I was kind of preparing. Like, if we want to go back to that slide real quick, that statement, to live in those gray spaces, I've been really curious about that negotiation with a lot of what you were talking about, right? We saw Blue Beetle. I was really excited about what Blue Beetle was doing at the time. And then we see these spaces. I was very excited to see that they selected Bad Bunny.
Yeah.
Because maybe that just functions in some way as an awareness, an attempt at creating a story thinking space that still persists. I don't know, but I just wanted to offer that as I was considering how you were discussing how we persist.
I mean, people were critical of J-Lo, right, and Shakira when they got up there and did their thing for the Super Bowl because they're like selling out and all of that stuff. I didn't see it that way. I saw it as a masterful way of bringing into kind of mainstream imagination in this sort of choreographed, very politically choreographed move where you had the children, including her daughter, right, in cages, and then what-ifing their dance out of the cages as something super liberatory. We'll see with Bad Bunny what happens. I'm optimistic. Again, Bad Bunny, little s, moving into big S, and not forgetting the little s, right? Not forgetting the little s. Not forgetting the rear view mirror that we see every day when we wake up, where I could have ended up in juvenile hall along with my buddy Miguel, right? That kind of urgency in everything that I do in my waking and my sleeping hours, right? Motivating, driving me to do the story thinking and story making, the educating, the opening up spaces for all of the cool stuff that we do, right? I mean, look, Wakanda forever. How cool, speaking of big S.
My mother and her village were driven from their farms by Spanish conquistadors who brought smallpox, a hateful language and dogma from another world. Facing starvation, war, and disease,
The lights a little
my people turned to Jack. Nothing could prepare me for what I found there.
¿Quién es este niño? ¿Ah?
¡Sos un demonio! ¡Hijo de Satanás!
Spanish man of faith cursed me as he died by my hand. He called me
Un niño sin amor.
El Niño Sin Amor. The child without love. And I took my name from there. Namor. Because I have no love for the surface world.
Ryan Coogler, Black director, very intentionally hires into his writing, creating space, Latinos, educators, professors, right? Deep knowledge of pre-Columbian, our histories, conquest, takes a superhero from the Marvel comics space and rebrands them Namor, right? Like, this for me is pinnacle, extraordinary. And the story itself might have gone a little farther. I would have liked to kind of seen like how global corporate kind of greed and capitalism was the actual instigator and force of division between black and brown. But it's there. It's enough for me to do something with, right? And for my students to see and feel and experience and understand. So yeah.
Well, but it goes back to the story thinking, in my opinion, because when you say it does enough, for me, it did enough for me to start rethinking stuff, right? Like,
Awesome.
I saw that and I was like, oh, this is so amazing. Okay, not that part. This is amazing. Okay, not that part, right? I suddenly had this agency of a Latinx superhero, and I identified them as a superhero, right? This individual who, it was enough. What Coogler did in that film for me and for the kiddos, because they were old enough, it was like, you're sitting down watching. Like, for us, it was this fascinating idea of what I, at the time, didn't know was story thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah. Gorgeous. Love it. Comics, as you know, is my jam. And actually, Diana, when I was here as a visiting professor, Solana's this, how many, 15 years ago, something like that. You know, being introduced to the archives here and doing all sorts of really cool stuff with our students at MSU was actually, I think, the beginning of my academic like deep dive into getting the stories of Latino comics creatives from all over the country. So this is driving, taking buses, taking planes, wherever, all over. This is pre like Zoom and all that stuff. Because the living, breathing archive was the stories of these comic book creatives all over the United States that were Latino doing stuff that didn't know each other and didn't realize that there was a Latino comics archive that they were creating in the present living, breathing moment. And, you know, for me, that is education in practice, in making, knowledge making, and knowledge space clearing in action, right? And in many ways, that's been like what I do in, you know, all of my academic work. We did this deliberately. I work with an illustrator, Miguel. I do the thumbnails and the script. He does all the inking and the art because, yeah, he's just awesome. But we decided to do this exactly like the codex, right? So here our figures are on side view, right, like a codex, and it tells the history in the visual here of the evolution, say, if you will, or the story of Latino comics in the United States.
So I was going to ask if you could spend a little bit of time talking about this, because when I was in CDMX, like I was at the National Museum there. They have like a replica of one of the original codices, and I was just curious about these nuances. If you could speak a little more about that intentionality.
Yeah, because what are we doing? We're not only telling the story of now, and that story of now is itself an epistemological space, a knowledge space for us to share with our students, our colleagues, our new generations, and our creatives. But it's also a way of reclaiming and affirming the deep, long history of us telling our story through comics. The Codex is a comic. You know, people are like, the origin of comics is, 19th century British, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, heck no. We were doing this stuff way before that. So double duty here, double dipping. Okay, I'm telling you, this is like Latino comics. These are all the kind of main figures. We have Jaime Hernandez on campus, one of the big ones. And at the same time, in this indirect way, celebrating the fact that, guess what, we were telling our stories through the visual as the dominant way before anybody else. Just saying.
Well, as we kind of continue, this idea of what you're currently doing, right? These comics and the way you're currently, and I'm just really curious about this. Like, you're currently the director of the Latinx Pop Lab over at UT Austin. And as I was doing my homework, as a good student
Let's
does,
see if
by
we
the
can
way.
get that
So,
slide up here.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Salah, Diana, I did my homework. I did.
Let's
As I was doing my homework for the present.
We're going to try and find that slide, I promise.
Yeah.
There's a lot up here, so we'll just find it. We'll find it.
You're working on a database.
Yes.
And I'm just fascinated by this database. Would you be willing to share it? Because I just did this unplanned deep dive into the database, and it's like living and breathing. I'm really curious about this idea.
Well, yeah, because, okay, so, I mean, this isn't the database. This is a shout out to all of our archivists and librarians, our curators of exhibits, because these are really important spaces to get the little S out into the big S spaces. But yeah, the database is really, it's a living, breathing database because, yeah, we need that archive. We need, my first book on Latino comics, awesome, but it's print, so it can't grow in the same way that our digital databases can. Our digital humanities, right? Our digital database, our archives, our repositories that are literally breathing and growing every day. So we're adding new talent constantly because guess what? It is growing. It has gone from a Latino dominant male like space to Latina and Latinx, like completely like all over glorious, gorgeous like space of story thinking, story making. And so yeah, so the Latinx Pop Lab has a link to a repository, a digital repository where we are on track with all of that. The Latinx Pop magazine is important because not only gives my students, our students, the opportunity to take classroom knowledge and make it public facing, right? Make it public facing, but also in and around objects that don't get the same attention, right? That the other big S objects get. Latinx Pop Magazine is another place for that opportunity of story thinking in the making, right? So yeah, constantly doing this kind of stuff. What can I say? Yeah.
So I'm gonna use this remaining time to ask a question. I director to director, quite honestly.
Okay.
Currently, we're negotiating a really interesting time on a national level, and I'm often kind of negotiating the precarious nature of honoring and supporting our students to continue to think in this story making way, right? Where story thinking is part of the story they're currently creating while they attend university here. In the Pop Lab, how are you all currently planning? How are you all working on continuing to promote that story thinking freedom, right? Because I'll full transparency. I think when I think about story thinking as it relates to where I am at right now, it feels a little more precarious than it did a couple years ago, than it did 4 years ago, than 5, 10 years ago for me. So I'm wondering, as a director, how are you negotiating that in the Pop Lab?
Okay, well, one really easy answer is that it's not a center, it's a lab. It's the Latinx Pop Lab.
Okay.
And so it is classified as research.
Okay.
And I don't know about Michigan, but in Texas, research is hands off. At least, right, touch wood. Now, if it were a center, then yeah, probably there would be all sorts of stuff that I would have to be negotiating. It is a research space. It's a lab. And that's how I envisioned it before any of this stuff, thank goodness. But it's not only a lab, it's a collaboratory, right? Because it's not just people like with their microscopes like in isolation from each other. It's collective daydreaming and doing and making, right? It's thumbnailing, it's 3D printing, it's analog typewriting, zine making. It is what if space collaboratory manifesting in whatever form you want it to manifest. I think if I were to give advice to director, my advice would be right now, we keep doing what we do, but we might need to, I'm just gonna be honest here, while we're undercover, you rename some stuff. I'm just gonna be honest. It could even be your class, okay? You retitle that class. We get through a couple more years. We'll be here. We're going to be here when we'll be here in strength and numbers. But yeah, there are like practical things to think about. Yeah. The Latinx Pop Lab, fortunately, because of the naming, survives. And it's because of that naming that the BIPOC Pop, which is this event every March, still has funding. Right? Nobody can touch that funding because BIPOC Pop Expo and Symposium is research. Okay? It's research. No one can touch my money for that. And here's a nice little, I think. Will it work? Maybe not.
Creative scholars and industry leaders working in the comics, gaming, animation, and multimedia arts for 3 days to focus on strengthening community, the sharing of cutting-edge, creative critical knowledge making, and the graphic storytelling arts. The event included panels, workshops, and a comics expo.
Yeah, BIPOC Pop, and it's safe. It's safe because it's research. I don't know the legislation and policies in place here, but for now in Texas, research is, sacrosanct. Nobody's going to touch that. I will tell you this as a professor, that there are some colleagues who've had to rename the titles of their classes because of the stuff that's going on in Texas. But guess what? My class, it's not Latinx pop culture, it's story thinking through pop culture. But guess what? Our primary texts are going to be Latinx. But the title of it is story thinking. And guess what? We're going to keep doing what we do. And then a couple years from now, we'll pop back up. Change it again. Right? Yep. Yeah, so we survive. We figure out our ways, we survive.
So speaking of survivability.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, anything else? I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Speaking of survivability, I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about, and you alluded to it already, you mentioned it, AI.
Yeah.
Right? I think there's, I've seen some trends on AI or online in social media platforms where they ask AI to be bilingual, right? I'm curious what your take on AI currently is and where you see Latinx narrative functioning in relation to AI, this idea of how AI functions for story making for a lot of folks.
Okay, so thanks, Sam. Again, a nice softball for me. But so I have interactive Wednesdays, analog, all analog. I do fishbowl debates. I do canned jury, we're gonna for, this film that we watched for class and this article, we're gonna now be the jury on it. I do Jeopardy stuff. Okay, very interactive. That, by the way, is another thing that we need to do more of in our classrooms because we are losing our students to AI. Guess what? Our biggest way to defeat AI, and I'm going to qualify this in a second, is getting the students to interact, to do and think on the spot, to debate, to do all these really creative, critical things together, right? Okay, that's my Interactive Wednesdays. But guess what? Fridays, I have their pod project where I deliberately tell them in the instruction and their prompt for that weekend's pod project to lean into AI. But I tell them to lean into AI as tool and not as the thing that does the work and the creating and the creativity. That I want to feel the presence of the human story thinking and making in that pod project result that they post on Sundays. Okay, so, and I tell them to use their smartphones for these projects. They make short videos that are based on readings and viewings from the week, and then they 2 60-second videos that create tension between the child's lantern way of seeing the world and exploring and experiencing, and the adult's more flashlight focus. I'm just giving you like a quick example. Reenact these with your pod, your partners in your pod, and stitch it together, and then maybe create some tension. Add a little critical like VO or some subtitles, etc., right? I have them lean heavy into the AI as tool because guess what? They're using it anyway. And I might as well like have them like use it in a way that's creative, critical, and what if forward possible thinking.
I appreciate that. I'm gonna think about it because I will admit I'm still kind of I don't know, right? Well, as it relates to this story thinking practice, right? We have about 180 seconds left for our allotted time. So I wanted to end first by saying thank you for your time, but also I wanted to ask: is there anything that you want to share with the community, and if you have a little more time, where do you see Latinx narrative, the little s, revealing itself more and more, let's say, if you had to forecast the next 5-6 years?
Well, I mean, it's happening and it has always been happening, little s. And I mean, basically where we're gonna see it is to continue in the little s spaces because we don't need to go knocking on doors hat in hand to get money. We can do it. And we are doing it and we have been doing it. Right? You have a computer, I have a typewriter and a computer, and I have like paper and pencils in my lab. Heck, I'm gonna keep going, until the heart in my chest stops beating. And it's the same for our students. So yeah, what we do is open the doors, give tools and access, and grow critical skills not only in the doing but in the thinking and the story thinking, and we will keep flourishing. In the end, what is it? We want all of us, not just those of us in this room, but those of us who might not be sitting on the same side of the table of us in different rooms. We want story thinking universally because when someone has control over the narrative, they disallow the kind of complexity that we are. And that's what leads to division and violence and trauma, right? We need to keep opening those spaces for story thinking, story making, because we want everybody to have control over their possible future selves.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We've traversed and gone beyond quite a few borders today, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks for the chat. And thanks for being here, y'all. I'm really grateful that y'all were here. We're gonna spend a few minutes after just hanging out. If you want to ask a couple questions or
Maybe some questions.
just thank you for your time, everyone. Thanks for being here.
But maybe there's some questions as well. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah, Deanna. Salah as well, I think. There was cards actually.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. It's not a major, but it's a core of classes where people are going into the lab. So the goal is to send out Latinx illustrators and storytellers from the UT BIPOC Lab.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it?
Yeah, but you can't. I mean, Deanna, also like my students. Some of them they're not illustrators. Like, we have a pro in the room with us right now. Guess what? They clip stuff out of magazines, or they bring photographs that they've actually printed at Walgreens. And they use those as their panels. And then they type with the typewriter in the lab and stuff. So even if there isn't a pairing, say in a pod where you have illustrator, writer, and then maybe a third, like, master of direction kind of, creative force, they find a way. The important thing is to provide a space and direction and allow that to happen, right? And that's what I think, for me, the future of universities are those kinds of spaces. I think that it is trying, like, I would never spend my time trying to like sleuth out someone who used AI. I don't even have writing assignments. I don't actually have writing assignments, and I am a professor in an English department. I have pod projects. And guess what? They love the pod projects because they get together every Friday, three in a pod, and they spend time together. They're not like this. They're together, putting their brains together, creating something that then we can talk about on Monday, right? And celebrate. So that's the future for me, even big universities. Like, we need to get rid of the big lectures. I'm just being serious. Like, we need to figure out a way to go to the model where we have interaction between students with professors, whether it's Socratic debate or critical creative, because if we don't, we're gonna lose the game. We're gonna lose the game. AI is way too sophisticated and fast. AI can make a 5-page, 5-paragraph essay that analyzes, a story from Through Fences in a way that is unbelievable, in like right in front of your face. So that's the game. That's a game we've lost. But have we lost? Only if we think of it as a loss. We need to think of it as a tool. How can we get ahead of the game, ahead of the train, and use this actively, AI as a tool, to create spaces where the students grow their critical, creative, story thinking, story making, right, capacities. Sorry. I get really you can tell, I don't care about this stuff. So you had, I think, some.
It's great having you here. And it must have been more than 15 years. It must be like 20 years since you were.
Yeah, it was 2004, I think.
Okay, yeah. So that was great, and I wish we could see all of it. I love the work that you're doing and really admire it. But I have it's sort of a technical question. Art Spiegelman gave a presentation at the Chicago Institute of Art on Monday, and I was on Zoom listening to him. And he did a great history of comics. And one of the things he says is that the word story, I didn't check to see, but the word story is also like first story, second story, third story. And that part of the history of the word story and like why it's used, like as the story for a building. Like he tries to make the connection between comics and their structure as like layered and that. But in Espanol, it's cuenta, and so like cuenta is like contar is like to count really, and like story. If you look at the Latin root, it comes from historia, which is like history. So that really works with you. But contar is a little bit different because like la cuenta is also you know the bill.
Yeah.
And so that you pay. And so like I'm kind of interested in how you
So
do
that's the A equals B logic thinking that's destroying the planet right now, literally. Like that's AI algorithms are that thing, the cuenta thinking, okay, in the sense of the bill thinking, right?
Right.
And they're sucking up lakes, these huge energy like factories that are sucking the resources of the planet when you put a prompt in, one prompt, right? So yeah, the algorithm of the logic-based thinking is destroying the planet. Sorry.
So the question is, like, how do you translate story thinking in Spanish when you have cuenta and it's kind of etymology being associated more with like a different like historia? It totally works, right?
Okay.
But like it becomes more difficult to sort of think about like that idea.
You're such an academic.
Sorry. Yeah, I was born this way, actually.
Anybody want to answer that for me? Yeah.
I was going to switch the subject a little
Okay. Well, before you switch it, let me just say one thing. Cuenta. Go ahead, Sam.
Well,
you say it. You do.
This is the part for me that I get really curious about because when I think about this concept of comics being connected to the codices as this meaning-making process through language and pictures, if you will, right? I mean, this has been going on. I mean, it's been going on for thousands of years, and I think what we call it, for me, is going to continue to maybe evolve, right? It's what is done that I've always been fascinated by, right? So, in Maya communities, excuse me, I apologize. In Maya communities, I mean, they already had schools, right, before Harvard, but we didn't call them schools; we called them calmecacs, right? And we had these keepers of the heart who would their job was to jot down everyday happenings and goings on in life. They were called traquilos, right? We might call that escritores, right? We might call them writers, right? But the act itself, I think for me is what I've kind of been most fascinated by recently as I've kind of negotiated this. So like for me, story thinking, you're right. It could be cuenta, or it's the idea of like pensamiento, right? Which I do want to name that colonial presencing of Spanish, right? When we try to transpose the language that describes the act of, right? So for me, I don't know the answer, but I think there's a part of me that desires to focus, and maybe this is just me emoting right now, right? But it's this idea of me wanting to focus on the act itself that and the agency it affords me, right? I think that's what, I'll be honest, a lot like thinking about story thinking, like the idea of being able to do that. I've been processing this idea of agency. Like, oh, I have agency that for some reason I thought I had, but hadn't really connected to the act of story world making, right? I always began with what's the story world, not let me make one, right? And I think for me, what we call that act, I mean, it may evolve. Like that's how I kind of am embracing it right now, and kind of have been embracing this idea of this storytelling beyond borders, this storytelling beyond borders practice that it's kind of lived in at least my lived experience. You know, I don't know if that answers it, but it's kind of how I was negotiating the question.
There's another comment here.
Sort of a question and observation, and I go back to codex.
Yeah.
And the biggest codex that exists within let's say the Mexican American community is the Virgen of Guadalupe. But in that codex, was to the intent to be seen by the indigenous people. It was not for the purpose of the Europeans, but it was for the indigenous populations, because that's how they understood and read history. And the thing that sometimes we just sort of get messed up by looking at the picture versus who is that message intended for? Who is that story for?
Yeah, I
the
love
continuation of the story.
Yeah.
It didn't stop. It just continued. So when you mentioned that, and it's true that you will continue. You will find a workaround. You'll make it. And because I was thinking that in this country we've had at least 3 major deportations. You know, from the repatriados to the wetbacks, then to Trump. And our population has grown, is not shrunk. You know, and back to what you were talking about, that we will find a way, and generation after generation finds that way. So I really appreciate that insight, and also that story. How many times? I mean, because I was just having a conversation on economics, and right now we would be the 5th largest GDP country in the world if you just looked at the Hispanic GDP. And when you look how we've lost lands, we've lost properties, we've lost on and on and on throughout this period, and now we're the 5th largest GDP in the country. So we have resources. We got to know how to use those resources. So what are the stories about how to utilize those resources? Sorry, I didn't mean to lecture. It's hard not to.
Brittany, did you? Yeah, thanks for that comment. Really important comment.
Hi, I'm Harry.
Hi, Harry.
I'm a 3rd-year PhD student in the English department, and this is kind of surreal for me because I applied to UT Austin specifically to work with you. No, it's funny.
Never too late.
No, I got in, but all my family, they're all Texans, so I was like, well, I can't.
No, but I'm thinking maybe postdoc. Come on.
Yeah. I'm working on it. So the reason I say that is not just sort of an arbitrary connection, but one of the things that, you know, my committee and then really any academic I've talked to now is thinking about job market. And I'm just curious, like reflecting back on your career and your journey to this point, especially with, I think about Barbara Christian and the race for theory. And I want to create story as much as I theorize it. And so I'm curious, like, could you speak a little bit about navigating institutional support, being a storyteller, while also being your job to theorize about story?
Harry, thanks for that. And Barbara Christian, for those of you who didn't know her, was actually my mentor. And she died very young, but was one of the things there are 2 things that happened with Barbara Christian. One, she invited me over to a barbecue randomly, just said, you know, Aldama, come over, I'm having a barbecue, and I did. And guess who was there? Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Maya Angelou. I'm running home to get all my books off the bookshelf. And I'm gonna get them signed. I don't care. I have no shame. The other thing though was that she said, the one thing that I don't need to tell you is that you are standing on the backs and the shoulders of the many who have labored to make this an opportunity for you. You, in turn, will recognize and honor your elders and those that have come before to make sure that you have the opportunities. And you will do that because the Harrys in the world will come into your life, and you won't just be stuck in the library stacks writing your next book. You'll be making phone calls. You will be sticking your neck out for junior faculty of color, young faculty, young women of color who are aggressed. You will use whatever position that you have to continue to open doors and to build legacy. So my answer to you, Harry, is there are, and I'm sure you feel it already, your faculty around you that support you, that are doing the hard work and that are sticking their neck out for you. It isn't always the case, but it is with us, and it will be with you. That's what I have to say. Do not be discouraged. The job market is always a job market that is, fraught and troubled. It doesn't matter. You do what you do and you keep going, and you remember that you have that rear view mirror that reminds you every day of the people that have fought to open those doors, and you're going to be that person for the next generation.
All right, so I guess it's my turn now. Hi. So thank you for doing this. This has been an amazing talk. I'm Brandon, by the way. So I'm quite enamored with this idea of story think, and this whole interplay between big S and little s, but how it was spoken about. My question is big less and little s something that is always like opposed to each other, and like how does one negotiate like the transition from little s to big S, or from big S to little s, and is that transition possible? Because it doesn't necessarily read to me like you like big S isn't necessarily higher, it's just a different expression of story. So like how does one move back and forth between those worlds?
And Sam knows this, like I wrote a book on Robert Rodriguez, and I don't know, Spy Kids, everybody's seen Spy Kids, right? And one of the kind of moments, the big moments in my life, Salah, when I was like, okay, I'm done, I can like retire now, was after I spent a day with Robert at his Troublemaker Studios. And I got to like actually touch the Spy Kids like suits and like hang out with all the like, FX designers and costumers. And he was just unpacking his 3D camera for Dame to Kill Sin City. It was really exciting, et cetera. I got in my car, drove to the airport, and I'm like, that's it. I'm done. Like, I'm gonna go do something else with my life. Hit the peak. No, I'm bringing up Robert because like Ryan Coogler, I think, is another example where you have big money, big production S, but you still have the wherewithal of the intentionality of a creative who has the rear view mirror, right, moment, firmly in insight, and that is able, as I talk about with Robert, to smuggle in that little S into the big S. Okay, and by big S, what are we talking about? We're talking about basically big S as getting the kind of say, visibility of large numbers, okay? That little s's work their way to, but don't have the big kind of S splashes, right? So those are the directors, for me anyway, that are the most story thinking, story making, what if, innovative, right? People like directors on the block. They're not slipping into the A equals B formula, which is 90% of like what we consume in terms of mainstream story, they're the few who actually innovate because they're intentionally using story thinking muscle to story make in ways that put front and center colorism in our communities on a large scale, right? So I don't see them, of course, I am someone who studies pop culture, so I would never talk about one as being lowbrow, highbrow. That's not a part of our vocabulary. But I think what's interesting is like to think of the concept of story think and story make, and what you can do intentionally to bring that into the bigger spaces, right? To kind of like invite as our primary audience, us, and secondarily, the other audiences to get something. It's the moment in Book of Life. Remember Book of Life, right? Gutierrez's Book of Life, Jorge Gutierrez. Go see it if you haven't. There's the moment when the detention kids drive up in the bus to the museum, and they don't walk up, they're not invited to go into the main door. They're invited to go into the magical portal that opens at the side of the museum. And that's where the magic happens. In a mainstream feature-length animated film, it's the detention kids, the misfits, the others, right, that are invited as the primary audience of this narrative to story experience something that speaks to them, and secondarily, those that go through the front door are invited if they want to come along for the ride. But the primary audience is not the ones that normally go through the front door.
So like this, and like I think that the addition, the nugget for me is the idea that because of my lived experience, I understand the big S. And because of my lived experience, I get to celebrate the little s. Right? So for me, as you're kind of negotiating this, I think your question makes me think about what I think you identify when you on your work on Rodriguez as a mariachi aesthetic, right? Taking that really small budget and creating El Mariachi, it led to that big S production, the dollars, and this trilogy, right? Like there was multiple films that kind of come out of that little s moment, but all those associations I make with Dusty Roads and the idea of the cantina, the idea of navajas, right? Watching Danny Trejo, like all those little S moments where it's like, I am making these really unique connections that maybe big S audiences might not necessarily be making because they're watching it a different way through a different lens. I think for me that for me, your question really kind of motivates me to think about how I connect in my space as someone who can acknowledge and see the big S movement and celebrate the big S commitment, whether it's dollars, production, presentation, promotion, and also embrace the little s moments, right? For example, that video where Namor is talking about the origin of his name. I'm like, I didn't need you to translate that for me, but thank you, right? That was a little S moment where I'm like, that is so cool, right? And I'm just enjoying a film for the sake of it being the film, right? I think that's one of the brilliant things about Coogler, but.
Let me just add one last thing. I promise, and then we're gonna let you go because I know you're tired. But let me just say this. Those directors that we just talked about, and there are many others, are also unique because what do we do 90% of the time when we consume mainstream story? We have to do the hard labor of bringing little s into those spaces as allegorical palimpsests. We read meaning in because we're not the invited primary audience. What happens when we story think and you're the primary audience? Suddenly, something magical happens because we're not spending our brain power, our story thinking, co-creating power, doing all this work to make it work for us. All right, I'm gonna stop there. Brittany.
Thank you guys so much. Can we get a round of applause, please?
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for coming. It was really an honor to have you both work with us at the MSU Museum and, of course, being supported by the Diana Rivera and Pedro Rivera Endowment. We really do appreciate that. We have some sweetbreads out. Please help yourself. Take some home. Definitely there's plenty. And I went to El Supermercado Estrella up north, if anyone knows, so I hope that's a good place to go. And please definitely come tomorrow at the Multicultural Center. Dr. Aldama will be doing a workshop about oral history, so please definitely come and see us there tomorrow at the same time.
Thank you, Brittany. Thank you.